Hey everybody, this is Elea. It's a new sci-fi game. It's very 60s psychedelic sci-fi inspired, and there are things about it that I really hate, and I want to talk about those some other day. For now, I want to talk about the stuff I really love, and that's going to start with the interiors of the ships. These interiors are fantastic, and they use a lot of tricks that I haven't talked about before, so I think it's worth talking about them in some detail. First things first, I'm going to talk about these as you would use them in a modular setup, but I'm not convinced that these rooms are modular. They might be hardwired. We're going to assume they're modular just for the sake of discussion, and if that's wrong, that's fine, because you can still create this same look with modular elements. So this is an aggressively square room. In fact, all of Elea's rooms are aggressively square. How can you prevent that aggressive squareness from feeling oppressive and claustrophobic? I've talked about a lot of techniques before, and Elea doesn't use any of the ones I mentioned, so let's talk about some of the ones Elea does use. First, they use some technical tricks, some things that you might not be able to pull off unless you know your way around a renderer. They've got baked lights, real-time reflections, they've got some really wonderful volumetric elements. They use some cheap diffractive glass shaders that don't quite work but come pretty close. And it's all very good. It's cheaper than you might think. There are some shortcuts. If you look at the basketball, you can see how there's like a weird reflection of the basketball above the basketball, which is not where it would be. That's the sign that they're using some approximations to make this easier on my machine so that I don't overheat and have my machine explode. And those are some tricks you can also do. This is a simple Unreal Engine gimmick. You can do the same thing in Unity if you set it up right. But basically, if you want your games to look realistic, you're going to need to use baked lights, realistic reflections, refractive glass elements. There's a lot of tricks that you have to learn how to use, and that can be challenging, but it's usually worth the effort. Lighting is absolutely critical to your sense of realism because lights are what you see. They're what your eyes detect, and therefore your eyes are extremely used to seeing lights behave correctly. So when your lights behave wrong, you get a sense of unrealisticness that only compounds the squareness of the rooms. When the lights behave well, you can forgive a lot, and the soft, off-tan coloration of the room helps to make this room feel a lot less claustrophobic. There are a lot of other tricks they use. They have a really good decal system, like you can see here. They've got some floor decals, and they use these floor decals pretty aggressively. If you do not have floor decal capabilities, or decal capabilities in general, you're going to have a hard time doing that. But if you do have decal capabilities in your game, you should make aggressive use of those decals because they make your rooms feel unique rather than repetitive. You can reuse the same floor 100 times, and if you just have different decals on them, nobody will ever realize it. There are some cheaper tricks you can do, and one of those cheaper tricks is topological. You can simply soften the room by literally softening it. So you have these rounded walls, these rounded edges, that'll soften your room. You can have literal soft walls. That'll soften your room. And you might think that this looks really expensive, but it's not. These are not actually modeled into the environment. They are a very simple flat plane with a shader that has a height map attached to it, so it gets some parallax going. They're very cheap. And you can do them in Unity and Unreal both, and it works great, especially with baked lights. Another thing you can do is you can have really, really nice ceiling elements. This is something I've not talked about very much, but in this case, this gorgeous ceiling element sprays across the room and hooks it all up, and it makes it feel like the room is outside. This soft ambient glow is very similar to what you might get if you were, underneath a noonday sun, playing in the park somewhere. It feels fantastic, and it really connects the room and softens the whole experience. Unfortunately, if you're not doing baked lighting, this kind of light fixture is almost impossible. It requires some really, really aggressive area lights, and those are tough. So you might not be able to duplicate this kind of beautiful overhead fixture. Let's go into this room over here, and we'll talk about some more tricks they do. First off, same exact room. It's the exact same room, they just didn't light it different. They just put different lights on it, and that means that it feels completely different. Same meshes, different lights, different result. So that's great. That's a good way to do it. One of the things you might not realize is that these two rooms are literally identical in terms of their height and size, but the room over here cheats. This staircase, which goes down into the gym, doesn't actually go down into the gym. It goes up from the gym. This floor that I'm standing on, this is the floor of this room. The floor that people think is the floor are elements that were added on top of the floor. These are floating a meter above the real floor. That's a great way to break up the squareness. You can always put things on top of your floor. You don't have to engineer holes in your floor to have staircases go down. You can sometimes have those staircases go up, like this. This also brings you very close to the ceiling. It's just right above our heads, and that's one of the reasons I didn't turn on the ceiling lights. This would have been blinding with this ceiling this low. It would have also felt a little obvious if we went from having a glowing ceiling fixture here directly to having the same glowing ceiling fixture over here. But you know, either way, having this fixture be off was a good idea, and it worked great. It gives us a completely different feel. Another way to break up this sort of oppressive squareness is to create windows. This is inside of a spaceship, so there aren't really any side windows, but there are some floor windows, and this is a wonderful trick. These floor windows don't exist. This is just a flat panel applied to the floor with a special shader that pretends to have depth. You can see some of the cheats they're using if we look at it from this angle. You can see how they're using some really aggressive refractive cheats. And it's not realistic, but it does make the room feel interesting and deep, and it fits in very well with the kind of 60s roller disco feel of the space station. So again, there's no actual mesh hole in the floor here. It's just a flat panel stapled to the top of the floor. The Nook over here is a pretty standard idea. You're going to need a Nook in order to get anything out of your square rooms. If your square rooms can't have Nooks, then they are too square. This Nook in particular, it might be a little bit difficult to make repetitive because it's actually aligned with the floor above the floor, this meter-high floor floating above the intended floor. That might be a little bit difficult, but my feeling is that they just went ahead and smashed it through the ceiling anyway. They didn't really care whether or not things lined up properly because the seams aren't obvious. So my guess is that if this room was full height, then this would be just fine being a meter down further, and it would have just another meter of purple above it. But I can't say that for sure because it may be that all of this was hand modeled to fit perfectly. It's impossible for me to say whether this is modular or all one-offs. One thing to note is that all of their objects are gorgeous. Everything in this game is modeled with this gorgeous alien aesthetic. It feels like what you would have gotten if Alien was supposed to be set on a posh, expensive ship rather than a piece of shit ship. It just works wonderfully, and it always looks fantastic, and I love it. Again, tricks, this is not... that one might actually be real. I guess that one's probably real. You can just use the glass interchangeably. Sometimes you can use real glass, sometimes you can use faked glass, whatever makes you happy. So let's go out into the part that is deeply alien-inspired. Oh, look, here we are on the Nostromo. I love these hallways. These are what convinced me to make this video in the first place. These hallways are excellent. They are aggressively square, so let's talk about how they've softened that a little bit. They haven't softened it very much because they want them to feel claustrophobic, but they've softened them a little. One of the ways to soften the squareness of your modules is to break up the edges of your modules. So here we've got a cord running from one module to the other. It crosses over a seam between modules, and that's a great way to make the player forget that there is a seam. And I don't think I've mentioned that before. It's well worth mentioning here. Cross the seams, and everything will look better. The player will be much more convinced if the seams are blurred. Another thing worth considering are the walls that they're putting on their hallways. Now, when you are creating hallway walls, the ideal here is to have them be repetitive, so you don't need very many of them, but you also need the player's eyes to slide off them rather than making them feel so distinct. So the player needs to not realize that you're repeating the same mesh over and over. How can you do that? Well, in a situation like this, the big idea is that you create a repeating pattern that the player's eyes stop caring about very, very rapidly. And in this case, what they've chosen is a simple double step. So they got a 1, 2, and then again 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 1, 2. Everything comes in pairs like this. This is a fairly straightforward way to make the player's eyes sort of glaze over. They see two nearly identical things on the wall, and they immediately think, okay, those two things don't matter, because there's two of them. If there was only one of them, the player might be like, oh, those things matter. And if there were like 7 of them, the player would notice. The player would be like, whoa, there's a lot of those. But when there's only 2, the player knows there's just enough of them to make them not matter. You might be able to get away with 3 as well. And this is something you'll see happen a lot in hallway meshes or wall meshes when you're trying to make the player lose track of them and not realize they're repeating. Just make them repeat a couple of times within themselves, and the player won't notice when they repeat from wall to wall to wall to wall to wall. It's a pretty good way to do it. Of course, another technique is to make them incredibly bland, but that's not what these folks chose to do. These are not bland at all. These are gorgeous. Now, these are the same sort of trick that we saw on the floor in the other room. These are not actually deep elements. The interiors are not modeled. There's no mesh in there with 3 pipes running across it. It's just one pane of glass with a mesh with a material applied to it that makes it fake depth. And you can see how it sort of skews away in a slightly strange way. That's because of the shader that they used. But it still gives a wonderful feeling of depth without actually requiring any topology to back it up. So these are very cheap walls. They're much more lightweight than you might think they are. And although sometimes it doesn't quite work, it still works very well, and it makes the player feel like all of these things have depth and mass and exist in the world. And that's a real good trick, especially for something that you're not supposed to notice. So I do strongly recommend that you don't have to do this exact trick. You can, in fact, use topology if you want. But either way, you're going to want to make sure that your things feel like they exist. Your walls have to feel like they exist. And a great way to do that is to add depth to them. Another good way to do that is to add damage decals, or damage elements, water stains and stuff like that. But this ship is supposed to be new and shiny and sparkly, so we don't have any of that, at least not yet. It's really well thought out, really well executed, and you can learn a lot by studying modules like this. They are really, really gorgeous. And this is an environment that I don't mind playing through. This game has some really fantastic interiors. It has some really pretty mediocre other stuff, though. And we're going to talk about narrative flow in probably my next video, but in order to actually talk about that, I have to beat the game so that I can restart the game. So it may be a little while. Have a good one.